Yeah, hey there, everybody. You're welcome to chapter 18, lesson 1, and what we're taking a look at here is the time period of the 1960s and 1970s from a perspective other than civil rights. So, if you remember, we had spent a lot of time already talking from, say, the 1950s to the mid late 1960s, 1970s, focusing just on African American civil rights. And in chapter 18, we are going to focus on the other groups of Americans that are going to see society change for them, in particular, looking at students, women, and Latinos. And in lesson 1, we're looking at students. So the way we're going to kind of frame this is we're going to call it the rise of the youth movement. And what you need to understand here as we're talking about this is that you have to have the right perspective. You need to realize that what we're talking about here is the baby boom generation, right? So if you remember, the baby boom generation starts out being born here in 1946, and as you can see just over here to my right, it runs just till about 1965. So this period of time, any kid born during that period of time is going to be a part of the baby boom generation. And so what we're considering here, what we're looking at is what happens to these kids as they get older. Right? So that when we hit the 1960s, the first of these kids is just about a mid-teenager, 15, 16 years of age, 17 years of age, 18 years of age. What's going to happen to these kids in the 60s and 70s as they get a little older? And what we'll see is that as they get a little older, we need to we're going to have to begin to examine how they change America with their numbers, with their influence. And what we want to start with here is that this youth movement is focused predominantly on what you can see right here highlighted in blue. The youth movement is focused primarily on white Americans, right? African Americans are fighting for their own civil rights. So white Americans, while there are some that help with African Americans' civil and economic rights, white Americans are focusing on something a little bit different. And what is going to kind of spur this youth movement among white America is this college enrollment group that is kind of fueled by this increase in numbers of young kids at just about the right age. So what I've done here is I have a chart, and it shows college enrollment by type, and at the bottom it shows numbers. So let me just show you what I mean here. I'm going to shrink that and get that out of the way so that we can get a better look at this. I'll put my head up there. There we go. So down below my head, you can see the different years, right? You can see in red, I've highlighted this year, 1949. This is just about when the very first baby boomers are, like 5 years old? And you see kind of an uptick in people going to college. Can you remember why that is? Why all of a sudden, like 1946, 47, 48, 49, we'd have so many more people kind of going off to college? Why that line would be rising dramatically? Can you remember? Search your brain for a sec. What was it? Do 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 do. Oh, screw that. It was the GI Bill. And so we'll begin to see people who served in World War II go to college with the GI Bill. But don't forget, these are older people. They have kids in that 45, 46, 47, 48, 49 range, right? So flash forward 18 years, right around here when we hit like this 1964, 1965 page, and look at just how high and how steep of a curve we see with the number of people attending college. And it just stays steep as more and more white baby boomers come of age for college and they attend. And don't forget, in part, that this is the whole point of seeing these people with their college degrees go off, and what does all that mean, and what does all that look like? Well, by 1960, the first are ready to go to college, right? And this college life that you get it's invigorating. It leads the baby boomers to question their parents. It makes them kind of wonder whether political leaders are telling the truth. Remember all those questions we saw with Vietnam, with issues like the credibility gap. Remember, we talked about the Pentagon Papers, we talked about Hawks versus Doves. This is when we see youths in America, especially white youth, begin to really kind of push the boundaries and the limits here. And so we wanted to give you some examples of what that looks like during the 1960s and 1970s. And in a most practical sense, one of the easiest examples to show how society changes for students in this lesson is by looking at something like free speech and seeing how students are able to increase their free speech. Oh no, something's going to happen here in just a second. Are you ready for it? Hold on. Yeah. And we'll see students really kind of increase their free speech by organizing. And remember, we see the civil rights movement teaching students here to organize. The civil rights movement benefited from organizations like CORE and SNCC. Well, students are going to benefit from the same as they kind of look at the things in the system, in the nation's political system, that they consider unfair, wrong, immoral. So as these students begin to organize, they join a group called the New Left. And the idea here is that all of the people that are concerned in America with different ideas, different political problems, they're going to join something called the New Left. And one of the groups that was the most prominent in the New Left was called the Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS. And their focus was protesting, no surprise, Vietnam. Other issues that they protested included poverty, campus regulations, nuclear energy. They protested racism. You can see here, for example, in the SDS pamphlet that I'm circling, this talk about self-defense, right? Remember Malcolm X was talking about self-defense for African Americans. You can see an African American depicted there with a rifle, with a gun, talking about self-defense. So the Students for a Democratic Society really are the major organization to take students, white students in particular, bring them together and get them moving to protest a particular political issue. I think another example here that we can use are protests behind what you see just above my head, free speech. And the idea here is that as students in the New Left, as students in the SDS organizations across the country began to protest things like Vietnam and racism, then college campuses are going to react and say, you know what? You need to calm down, kids. You're young, you don't know anything, you don't have any experience, just back up, take your time. And you're going to see them begin to actually restrict the ability of student groups on campus to recruit volunteers for political causes, to say you can't do that here. This is a place of learning. This is a place of study. You should be quiet and accept the teachings of the professors and not challenge authority, not question authority. And the youth movement, like Students for a Democratic Society, they're going to push to really target free speech. And they're actually going to give it a name. They're going to call it the Free Speech Movement. And their goal here in the Free Speech Movement, as you saw me just highlighted up over here, is to try and say, you know what? You are not going to be able to keep us quiet. You're going to have to deal with us. You're going to see campus-wide protests at places like Berkeley, where students and faculty come together to protest these issues of free speech and the attempts of colleges to restrict it. And the Supreme Court is going to side with these students. It's going to say, you know what? Students do have a right to free speech on a college campus. Just because it's a school doesn't mean you don't get free speech. So here's an example where we see students trying to come together, right, in the New Left, in groups like SDS, as you can see just above my head, and they're going to try and find a voice in protesting all of these political issues like Vietnam or racism and civil rights. You're going to see college campuses kind of strike back and try and limit that free speech, and students protest, take it to the Supreme Court, and they win. They're allowed to distribute that literature to recruit volunteers for political causes. They're allowed to hold these meetings that are designed to protest other political ideas in America. Yeah, victories like the free speech movement and victories that the Students for a Democratic Society had really began to encourage some members of the youth movement to not just kind of reform society, not just try to, create a society that experiences some kinds of change, right? Changes that might be like superficial, right? Like the way we dress or wear our hair. Those are changes to society, sure, but those aren't real kind of substantial changes, right? Those are kind of superficial changes. So some members of the youth movement begin to embrace something new, a different idea, and I'll highlight it here in red for you. It's called the counterculture. Look, and here's the idea, right? Culture kind of moves along in a certain direction, and when you change culture, think of it like this. Think of culture in this case kind of like, as I get this out of the way, and don't worry, I'll put that back up in just a minute. Think of it kind of like, I don't know, like a river, right? Here's a river, and it goes along just like this. Now, some people would say that, well, what if you don't like the way that river goes, right? What if you think that that river is going in the wrong direction? Well, there are people that say if you protest, right? If you change who you vote for, if you organize, if you sit in, if you use nonviolent resistance, you can begin to slowly over time change the direction that river flows in so that it's no longer flowing, let's say, south, it's flowing to the east, right? You're slowly making a change. You're working with the system, and over time, the direction of that river will change. There are some people that say, you know what, having a river that changes slowly over time, that's not for us. The problem is the whole river. These people embrace the counterculture. In the counterculture, it's not just about changing the direction of the culture, it's about breaking away from it entirely and going in a completely opposite direction. You're going counter to the actual direction that culture is heading. If culture in general in America says, I like steak, you say, I don't even like chicken, I don't like meat at all. I'm a vegan. If American society says, I think rock and roll is the best thing ever, you say classical music. In fact, I don't even like music. We should all just read books. It's this idea that you're completely against whatever the culture is for. And this begins to gain some ground in America because these people they're trying to express how different they are from mainstream America. They actually get called hippies, and you're probably familiar with this image of the hippie, right? This person with the beads and the long hair and the flower print dresses. But what we need to do is take a step back and actually look pretty hard at members of the counterculture because most of them, like if you look at this, for example, this picture, I'm going to get my head out of the way. You look at this picture. Just take a good look for it a second. Okay, all right. A lot of people there, right? Okay. So what, Mr. D? All right, well, let's just take a look at this picture. Okay, again. All right, a lot of people there. Okay, Mr. D, what's the point you're making? What are you getting at here? Well, one more picture. One more picture right there. Again, take a good look at them. A bunch of hippies, right? Laughing and singing at a concert. Yay, America, hippie counterculture. But I want to point out two things that I saw. Ready? One. Two. Almost everyone else in these pictures, and almost any picture that you find anywhere about hippies and counterculture, the hippies and the members of the counterculture movement, they're white. It's not a movement that is representative of most of America. Members of the counterculture are primarily middle class, upper class, college educated, the people that can afford to be hippies. And really they reject this idea of established society, and what they really want is this utopia, this idea that life can be freer, we can be closer to nature and full of tolerance and cooperation and empathy and all these things, and they are wonderful ideas. They really are wonderful ideas. The problem is they don't pay, right? America, and I'm not trying to be particularly callous here, right? But we all know that America runs on the dollar, and things like tolerance and cooperation and everyone just peace and love, well, unless everybody in America is on board with that, you're not going to survive. And the bottom line is only white kids from middle and upper class backgrounds are down with this. That's not enough people to make a change to the system, not enough people to run counter to the culture in order to make a change. And the bottom line is these middle and upper class kids need a job because they got to eat. They got to live someplace. And slowly the counterculture will fall apart because there's not enough money to go around. The counterculture will lose momentum over time because most of those young people that embrace this kind of going against the grain, right? This kind of moving with the counterculture, not the culture, they're going to say, I can't, we can't make it. We got to go back to mainstream American society. There are things that remain behind, of course, the music, the dress, etc. Right? We even have the modern day expression of the hippie in the long hairstyles or the hairstyles that we'll see today. Like we still see hippie hairstyles that kind of come about, this kind of rejection of conformity with the way we wear our hair or the dress that we wear, that kind of go against these traditional standards. And we see it all the time. In fact, if you want to see it today, I think the best place to see it, if you're looking for this today, would be, I think, this group of people right here, the hipster, right? Who are so cool. They were cool before it was cool, right? Who were so against the culture, or they were against the regular norm before it was ever the norm. So it's just this idea that they're kind of on the cutting edge. So we still see this kind of thing. We even still see, throwbacks to the way they wore their hair or their beards. We see throwbacks to the way they would have dressed back in the 60s, kind of this free spirit. So, it does definitely carry over. But all in all, there are some good changes. Free speech, organization, democracy, these things all benefit from the youth movement. And when we get together again in class, we'll do some work with this for sure.